Today I'm speaking with Daniel Dacombe. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Absolutely. And it's a privilege to speak with you. And just to give a quick bio here as we get started, Daniel Dacombe lives in Canada, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which I don't know anything about. Feel free to tell us about that part of the world in a minute with his wife and two kids. He's a social scientist with a master's degree in psychology from Walden University. He has worked in the field of mental health and addictions for over a decade. We'll get into some of that. And he grew up in a Presbyterian home and attended a church in the denomination called the United Church of Canada. I got to admit, I was going to add a joke there. Does anyone ever call it like the United Church of Canada A?
Um, Not that I'm aware of, but frankly, it's probably happened we're likely to admit.
Do you use that? What would you call that? So it's not a suffix. What is that?
Like a
Expression.
verbal tick, I think, and yeah, we do use it a lot.
Yeah.
I think at one point it was involuntary, and then people started pointing out Canadians say a lot. Now we're just doing it on purpose out of spite or
Yeah.
something.
For the tourists.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Daniel got saved as a child, but rededicated his life to Christ as a teenager and began at that point attending an evangelical church. He went to Bible college and worked in ministry with Youth for Christ. In the autumn of 2020, this is skipping over a lot, which we'll fill in the gaps here. But in autumn of 2020, he publicly acknowledged that he was no longer a Christian. So before we get into the meat of your story, could you tell us little bit more about yourself, maybe, and any hobbies or fun things we can know about you?
Sure. Well, to give you some background on Winnipeg, it's generally cold during the colder parts of the year, but we also get quite hot during summer. So we have, I think, the biggest temperature variance of almost any place in the world between the heat of summer and the cold of winter. So when people think Winnipeg is just a cold place, it's actually both when
Hmm.
when you get right down to it. For myself, other things that I'm into these days, I've been an unabashed geek for my whole life, if you couldn't tell from the lightsaber over my shoulder. Yeah, definitely a big fan of Star Wars, especially Star Trek, which has been, a long time love of mine. Um, and Yeah, generally just if it's nerdy, I've probably tried it out at some point.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's interesting timing. I literally just watched my first episode of Strange New Worlds last night. So
Oh, so
just
good.
just getting
That's
into it.
a real return to the classic kind of Trek stuff, but also bringing in the best of what's been happening in Trek and in the in that part of Hollywood for the last little while, where the main cast is very diverse and there's a lot of interesting topics they cover that really remind me a lot of the Next Generation. And people have been asking, after watching Star Trek Discovery and Strange New Worlds, when did Star Trek get so woke or so political? And I just kind of shake my head because it's been extremely woke and political the entire time.
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm. Well, that's very cool. Well, I appreciate your filling us in there. And in terms of what we like to do here, we'd love to just give people the chance to tell their stories. So if you could take us back to the very beginning in terms of what shaped your worldview and what you were taught and in church and by your parents and so forth. And I'll jump in with a few questions, but otherwise, we'd love to hear your story.
Sure thing. So I grew up in a Presbyterian home that was British, Scots, Irish, by descent. The United Church of Canada, where I attended with my family growing up, is an amalgamation of several different denominations, including Presbyterian and Episcopalian, into one denomination. It's an exclusively Canadian creation. Um, I wouldn't say my family was very conservative or fundamentalist at all. Um, we weren't, you know, we weren't a family that talked a lot about things like hell or the other kinds of things that I think a lot of the guests I've heard you talk about bring up as being major features of their childhood. I do remember attending the United Church. I remember, we sang hymns. I remember there were few people my age. I think the United Church of Canada is generally shrinking, um, and that's partly because the main attendees have been getting older and less young people are going. I do remember, when I was young, being scared of death and being scared of, like, our family dog died, and what does that mean? But I had, really caring parents who were giving us, I think, age appropriate information and didn't really, you know, when religion came up, it was a comfort. It was, it was something that was brought up to help, never to hurt. Um, so a lot of those kind of early memories aren't super negative.
Can I
Um,
ask, did you know other people that had the negative beliefs around you that you heard of through the grapevine, or was that not till much later?
I think most of that would have happened later. I remember, like kids do, you kind of talk about some of the things that you learn in church or that you learn in your family. And I remember some people sharing uh, some aspects of their faith, especially around things like the death and resurrection, and me thinking like, well, I do know that there's a guy named Jesus. I do know that he was born on Christmas and he died on, Good Friday, and he came out of the tomb on Easter. But you guys seem to be getting a lot more details. Some homes where it would if they were Catholic, they would have a lot more of like the Stations of the Cross, or if they were more evangelical, it would be a bit more, of a dramatic kind of story. But it wasn't really something that I think, especially at a young age, came up much. I had a lot of friends who were
Gotcha.
Jewish. I had a lot of friends who were indigenous. So it didn't always come up. Even the ones who were religious weren't necessarily extremely religious.
Yeah. Interesting. Cool. Thank you.
Another thing that really kind of defined or contextualizes my growing up is that I had undiagnosed ADHD. Um, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder comes in two main varieties. Most people are familiar with the hyperactive subtype. There's also the inattentive subtype, which is what I had. And there's a third combined subtype. Uh, Inattentive subtype was much less diagnosed, especially in the 80s and 90s. This isn't a failing of my parents or even a failing of the school system. If anything, it's a failing of the larger public health community in communicating what symptoms to look for. Kids who are inattentive just kind of get labeled as gifted but lazy or a bit of a space cadet. Um, I was insatiably curious, but I could not really focus on anything for an extended period of time unless I was fixating on it, and then sometimes to an inappropriate degree, I would fixate on it. So at the same time, I could work in bursts and accomplish things that were, uh, you know, really incredible at times for my age. And so I was called a gifted kid, but struggled to live up to that label sometimes.
Mm.
Um, and it definitely wasn't, like I said, a shortcoming on my parents' part, or even on the school's part, because no one was talking about what the inattentive symptoms looked like. Nobody was prioritizing it because generally, when a kid is bouncing off the walls because they've got the hyperactive subtype or the combined subtype, those are the kids who get diagnosed. Those are the kids who get acknowledged. Those are the kids who get help. For me, I had supportive parents who gave me every opportunity to grow and to learn, and were patient with me, and I managed to actually pull together a decent a decent brain out of the situation. And because I was, I think, given some tools by my parents, and because I was just naturally curious and naturally motivated to do better and to do interesting and important things. I I was a lot luckier than some people who grow up with ADHD or with a neurodivergence that's undiagnosed. Some of them never make it through university, or who struggle to maintain any relationships. I had a really supportive family who, even if they didn't know what, there was a diagnosis that could potentially be made, were caring and supportive, and helped me to be the best that I could be with what I had.
Mm. Can I
One of
ask,
the
did you
things,
find, like with you being in that spot with that condition, did you feel like your relationship with God was a place of comfort through all that? Like if if I feel like I don't fit in or something, at least I know God's on my side or I'm on his side.
When I was a child, not uh, my relationship with God, I guess, wasn't something that I thought a lot about in great detail.
Okay.
As I got older, one of the major features of ADHD that actually is not part of the diagnostic criteria, but does come up in the literature quite a bit. In fact, about a third of patients who have ADHD say that this symptom is their most challenging symptom, or the symptom that they hate the most, and something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. It's where you become very sensitive and very aware of the patterns of relationship happening around you, and where you become extremely sensitive to any perceived uh, breaking in the relationships between you and other people. So if a friend was upset at me about something, I would become incredibly sick, like to my stomach. I would become incredibly anxious. I would, uh, I wouldn't say panic attacks, but it would be, a really challenging experience when, I'd call a friend and they wouldn't call me back. I'd immediately think, well, they must hate me, and it's partly
Mm.
due to the peculiarities of how a brain's ADHD works in terms of the systems uh, of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter in our brains that helps us to feel good and normal and pleasure. And when it is in a state of deficit, then you feel the opposite. And so for people with ADHD who are experiencing rejection sensitivity dysphoria, it um, it can be a real challenge to to feel safe in your relationships. I think probably the only relationships that I felt truly safe in were the ones with my parents, and my friendships were always like a source of, um, I guess, a source of concern or a source of fear in that way. And so when I was older and attending an evangelical church, I was reaching out to God to kind of fill that gap, or to kind of make those feelings go away, or even to just provide, some or any comfort
Mm.
for those feelings. Maybe this is the relationship that, I could never get rejected from. And so I really latched on to those, never will I leave you or forsake you verses
Yeah.
as I was growing up.
It's interesting though to hear that. I know this isn't the direction you were taking it, but I
Mm,
could see other people growing up in other contexts who could, if they admitted they struggled with that rejection sensitivity, whether it's from ADHD or just a personality uniqueness, but that a lot of the theological concepts that come through in evangelicalism are that yes, God loves you, he'll never forsake you, but, and of course, fill in the gap there, but you can
mhm.
shipwreck your life. But he, God clearly says, if you regard iniquity in your heart, I will not hear you, I will not listen to you. So you can mess up, and David prays, God, forgive me for presumptuous sins. This idea of like second guessing yourself constantly, and that God clearly does use the language a lot of, I will bless you if you obey me, but if you disobey me, I'll curse you. And the curses will be quite nasty. And possibly you just be basically a write-off to God. And the rejection is kind of woven into the, if not the theology, the worldview and the culture. And I would argue too that some people probably do struggle. I haven't thought about it myself, but it's possible in my own heart even that as a kid, this struggle of like I struggled to wonder if God's really gonna be happy with me today. Did you ever feel that as you? I know we're jumping ahead here, but did you feel that part of it when you jumped into evangelicalism, or was that not a part of your story?
As I got further into evangelicalism, that became more of a feature. Um,
Okay.
and it really depends, as you know, it really depends on the emphasis on which parts of the faith that people are giving. A lot more progressive Christians will be focusing a lot more on the loving kindness aspects of the God character, and others who maybe feel a little bit more rigid in their thinking, or who are actually looking for that rigidity as a source of their own comfort, will gravitate more towards those other verses.
Mm.
Um, which is really, uh, when I started to realize that I didn't think I believed in God anymore, and I was asking questions of people who now finally who weren't Christians, and I said, I don't think I believe in the God of the Bible anymore, and they say, well, which one? Because not just in the text of the Bible that we have now here on our shelves, But even in the collections of ancient texts, the 60 odd books that went into the Bible, it's actually not the same deity throughout, especially in the earlier books, the Old Testament. And there, there's variations. There's even different places some of those books came from that might not have been referring specifically to this monotheistic Israelite God. And so that was an interesting kind of moment for me when I realized, yeah, I really had been believing in like one specific God that you can sort of find in the Bible, but other people will believe in, you know, um, different characters that are described as God in the Bible. One of the reasons why I think that the the apologetics industry is trying so hard to pretend that's not an issue. I remember Emerson Green, who runs the Counter Apologetics podcast, tells a story about meeting Frank Turek when he was still a believer, and saying, "Hey, Frank, like how do you reconcile the differences between the loving God of the New Testament and the judgmental God of the Old Testament?" And he just said, like, "There's no difference. Next question." So, I think that there are people who try to make that happen, but yeah, that was never really a major feature for me, especially growing up when I was young.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think sometimes for a lot of us that we're deep in evangelicalism, it it really is just it's not something anybody would ever acknowledge or publicly say. It's just like woven into the culture and the subculture of what you're taught and all the little
Mm-hmm.
sermons. And um, it's just a fascinating case study, to be honest, to think about the ways in which just your entire worldview and the way you're preparing for teenage years and the way you're preparing for an adulthood is this question of is are the most important people, I mean, arguably, the most important person in the universe, is he happy with me today or is he kind of grimacing? And just the,
Mm-hmm.
the effect that has on you, you feel like, especially once you get into puberty or other issues where you're like your hormones are coming in and you feel like you can't measure up. You just can't not, think certain things. And you just feel like you're pretty much set up to fail at that point. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. I want to make sure we get back to your story.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's an interesting point too, because the way that we construct relationships with other people isn't just to like have a direct, like Daniel and Tim have a relationship, have a friendship. You and I both create constructs of each other inside of our heads, and we have relationships with those. And when you act in a way that's different from what the construct of Tim that I have in my head is, then I either adjust that construct to be more in line with your actual character, or I might get upset with you for behaving in ways that I think aren't, this isn't like you. This isn't like the relationship I have in my head. And so we're all, when we start believing in God, we start creating that construct. We start creating that, um, that relationship in our heads. Now, the fact that there's no actual object to have that relationship with is really irrelevant at that point, because we're always having those relationships with the constructs.
Yeah.
And so I think for people who are unfortunate enough to develop a very judgmental or hateful kind of construct, they're always going to have that kind of tension, I think, in those relationships. Um, and for me, there was definitely a bit of that as I got further into evangelicalism and encountered things like Calvinism and other you know things that you want to scrape off the bottom of your shoe. There was definitely a bit more of that happening for me.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it for Calvinism. It's interesting too how many ways in which some of this stuff ends up weaving very closely to our relationship with our parents.
Hmm.
And like just for my story, and I won't take long for this because I want to get back to yours quickly. But my dad was very much that what kind of mood is he in today, and are we going to have a good day or is he going to fly off the handle? And it just would be like a ping pong table of his emotions, but it
Hmm.
seemed like it was woven into the theology as well of like, but this is exactly what God does. He says, if you obey me, then we're going to have a good day. If you disobey me, we're going to have a bad day. And it's not just like, well, you need to do the right thing. It's that I'm literally going to be like condemning you and looking down on you. And I think
Yeah.
when you weave that into, part of that I'm sure was that he lived that way because that was part of his theology and his worldview. But I think when you sort of have that coming at you from physical directions from your physical parents and
Mhm.
spiritual, and maybe your pastors and other spiritual leaders, it just you end up with this. I say this a lot, and other people say this a lot, but this dual personality thing where you're like you're completely safe in your own skin. You're wrapped up in the love of God, and it's so beautiful. And you're completely not safe in your skin at the same time. And it's I don't know if the right word is schizophrenic or bipolar, but it's like you've got these two different people in you, and you're not sure what kind of day you're going to have. And it's like,
Mhm.
or even what minute or hour you're going to have. You go back and forth, and you feel like the carpet's always about to be pulled out from under you. It's a very weird feeling.
I've definitely heard people talk about their faith experiences in that way, especially those who've had those really challenging, family environments to grow up in. I think that actually might be why I never really struggled truly with this idea that no, God actually hates me. Like I'm, not for very long, anyways, because the most consistent and the best human beings I know are my parents.
Mm,
They're both Christians. They
that's awesome.
act out their beliefs in the world in the best way you would want people to. In their retirement years, they're spending them with street involved people and who have mental health or substance use health struggles, and without judgment and without expectation, they're just living lives with people. I think the church that they go to in the inner city right now is the membership is primarily people who are unhoused or who are having those kinds of daily struggles. And growing up, it was never a I never felt judgment or condemnation from my parents, even when I made mistakes. So for me, it was very easy to construct that character for God in my head that was similar to my parents, which is partly why I think I was so confused when I meet people who be like, well, no, like, but God's very holy, and He's very righteous, and our sins are really like just so awful in His sight, like even the smallest kind of. And I just thought, well, I can't imagine my parents ever treating me like that. How much less so would God treat us like that? So really, the I think the pain and the fear and the anxiety that gets kind of caught up with that stuff, it came so much later for me than other people. It really came more when I was 15 and I started attending an evangelical youth group, and uh, you know, partly because I was curious, partly because I was a little lonely. Because with rejection sensitivity, you always feel like your friendships are about to go away. Partly because there was a lot of girls there. Like I started attending, and that's when also like the more intense concepts of hell came in, which then I did start to feel a bit of that fear. But it was really quite a new experience for me because, like I said, growing up, there was just none of that. And so when I was about 15, I started attending this group, and I was baptized again when I was 16, because when you're Presbyterian, you get baptized as a baby, and then when you join evangelical church, they tell you that you need a second coat, and so you get baptized again.
Exactly.
And that's yeah, so that
So
was the start of also a lot of really really good friendships, some of which I still maintain to this day, and some haven't survived my transition, and that's okay.
hmm.
Um,
Could I clarify what when you were doing that as a teenager, call it rededication or making sure you were really saved? Just for
mhm.
anyone that's listening, if you were to have at that point been asked by a friend that maybe wasn't a Christian, what did you just do? Like, what is this? What does it mean to be at peace with God, or however you'd phrase it, to accept the gospel? What is that? What's actually happening in that transaction in terms of the theology and the courts of heaven?
So I think that the phrasing that was being tossed around at the time was asking Jesus into your heart, and there was you know I think some like adoptionist language that was also being used, like you're being adopted into God's family, and you know you're uh, now your sins are forgiven, and of course, like teenage boys, you're sinning basically constantly, so you kind of go back with a bit of anxiety, like, but I also like, I mean, I had bad thoughts about a girl today, like what, like am I, when you call them bad, they're actually just natural thoughts,
Right.
uh
But yeah, when you're in a
and
Christian environment.
when you yeah, and then there's that kind of anxiety there, and so I started importing some of more of those beliefs into my brain as a result of involvement in youth group and in church. And I was really going all in. I think at that point, I attended youth group a couple times a week. I was going to church on Sundays. I sometimes went to another youth group with some other friends, um, and I was just really kind of going all in on this new identity. And a lot of the people I met were very, very kind and supportive. And the brand of evangelicalism that I was getting into is an Anabaptist tradition called the Mennonite Church. And I didn't know it was called the Mennonite Church at the time. It was actually technically the Mennonite Brethren denomination. There's a bunch of Mennonite denominations. When people hear Mennonite, they sometimes think like, living on a giant farm complex with like little caps on the heads. And that is still the way it is done in some places. But in this area of Canada, in this area of the province of Manitoba, there's a lot of Mennonites who are as modern as everybody else, and they own businesses, and they go to school with everybody else, and they go to universities, and they're just like we're all just regular people over here. But there's several Mennonite denominations, and that was the one that I was going to at the time.
Mm.
So it wasn't especially charismatic, and it wasn't especially fundamentalist, but it did have a pretty strong emphasis on being a Bible-led church. So like the phrase "getting back to the Bible" came up an awful lot, and there was praise and worship in a way that was different than it was when I was growing up. Like when you're growing up and it's somebody playing the organ and you're singing from a hymnal, and most people in your church have one foot in the grave because they're super old. Like there's not really a lot to get super pumped about, So suddenly there's like a band and there's like an electric guitar and drums and what the heck is this? It's like being at a concert. And so I got really into it, but I didn't. And this is something else that's sometimes a feature for people who are neurodivergent. I wasn't able to have religious experiences. So a lot of people were saying like, oh, I really felt like the love of God, when we were singing that, or I really felt the presence of God. And like, what does that mean? Like, I was very, I'm curious. I want to feel that too. And like, I felt emotional sometimes when we were, having music, but, I mean, I felt equally emotional when I was listening to music at home with my parents when it was really good music. And we listened to a lot of like folk music or Lorena McKennett or the Rankin family for like the two people from Newfoundland who listened to your show, or
Nice.
even Anya and other just stuff that was really like ethereal, and I felt very like calming and soothing feeling during that music, and I felt the same with the Christian music. And so what's different? I mean, if I'm or if I'm listening to a good rock and roll concert, I feel really pumped up, and I listen to worship, it's the exact same feeling. Is it God in both places? Like, do the tragically hip really, are they really giving me the presence of God? I'm not quite so sure. Gord Downey was an amazing singer, but I don't really know if he was doing that for me.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel that um, I didn't have any of those presence of God or spiritual experiences. And I remember going through a book series or a workbook with our youth group called Experiencing God, I think it was. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, I do.
With the black cover,
Yep.
and the basic premise was it's impossible to, you know, on your own like make yourself experience the presence of God. That being said, here's how you do it. And uh,
Nice.
it just never really, if anything gave me anxiety about God and where I stood with him, it was that. It was, why can't I ever feel like there's something actually there? Why can't I ever feel this presence or this safety or this feeling or this love or whatever it is that people are talking about? So the
Mm.
construct in my head that I was having this relationship with just there's no reciprocity. There's nothing kind of coming back from that. Um, I I really relied much more on this. This was a new subject matter for me to be obsessing about or fixating on. People with ADHD, we fixate very well when we're interested in something. So even as a teenager, I started like jumping into theology books and jumping into, you know, biblical studies, and it was all from a very evangelical perspective. So it gave you that narrow focus and didn't, stray away into the territories that secular universities would go into. It was very much like this is the right thing to believe, and this is how we know it is, and this is why you could ignore all that other stuff that says different. They're just confused, or they've missed this really this really simple fact that they're all just missing, and this is why we can have assurance of our faith. And so I latched on to those things. There was one book in particular, The Case for Christ, that I read and just thought, oh, this is just so like I'm so happy this book is here. But there was one little kernel in that book that actually, uh, just like a clam making a pearl, it became this like nugget in my brain that kept gathering material around it. And it was this chapter on evolution, where Lee Strobel, who's the crack investigator, trying to figure out if Christ was actually God, um, and he goes to talk to a scientist about evolution. The scientist, apparent scientist, I'm not quite sure who it was, says, "Well, evolution is clearly false, and here's all the reasons why." But I'd been paying attention in science class, and I'd read some National Geographics because I was curious about that stuff too, and I knew that, well, some of the things he's saying isn't actually true. Some like that's actually not accurate. That's like I've seen like a whole bunch of other people saying this other information, and they seem to be able to back it up. And this guy's just kind of giving his opinion. And that, if he's wrong about this, what else in this book is he wrong about? And that kernel just kept growing and growing, and it took quite a while for it to actually become a pearl, but it did eventually.
It's amazing how that works. Of the it reminds me of the whole Wizard of Oz, like just ignore the man behind the curtain, just take my simple answer and let that be more than sufficient. And it's like, yeah, and the fact too that so many times when you try to bring it to their attention and say, like, do you realize this is an issue? They get upset or they ignore it. And then of course they don't even want to like acknowledge that there's more information to bring in the discussion. I like to talk a lot about how with my deconversion, there was like several tracks going on. The main track
Mhm.
was like what I was learning, like just new stuff I was learning. But at the same time, there was this track of like, but I should have already been told this stuff. And like
Mhm.
it's not new information. It's just an emotion of feeling like this. You guys have kind of tricked me, or you've neglected to tell me critical information. And then there's
Mhm.
this track of like, okay, I'm going to bring the information to you so we can talk about it. And they're like, no, that's irrelevant, or no, that's not true. And then they would get like this track of like militantly angry when I'd be like, no, no, like this is really an important point. Let's dig in here. And like when you start, they like Christians seem so oblivious to the fact that when you add those tracks up, people are like, no way, like this, like you say, it's like this the piece of sand that becomes the pearl. You cannot, or a splinter in your mind, you cannot just keep living this way. You have all these issues. And I think the other side, that those other like three sidetracks, they become this issue of like, you're not my people anymore.
Mhm.
Once you realize that they're not willing to discuss it with you on a helpful level and on an honest level, it's really hard to consider them your people anymore. And I don't think Christians acknowledge and understand just the depths. And I remember always hearing stuff like, don't go to a secular school because they'll talk about this horrible stuff, evolution, and these godless teachers will distract you from the Lord. And it's like when you think about that at first glance, it does look very simplistic. Like, yeah, you want to keep your mind on the things of the Lord. You want people who will clearly push you to the Lord, to the Bible, and who are Christians. But at the same time, they're kind of acknowledging there's some information, there's some discussions that we'd really rather not have, or
Mhm.
like don't have them until you've had like 20 years of preparation through a seminary, and then you can go in there with your complete blinders on. And I don't think Christians think through this enough to think through what it does to people when they realize it's not just the information that I'm learning. It's the fact that you all don't give a damn when I say, let's talk about it. Or you give these overly simplistic explanations. And it's like, it blows me away the ignorance that they have, not just of the information, but of the dynamics of how this explodes in an inquisitive person's mind.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand when we're talking about kind of that end of things, how belief systems are formed and maintained. And there's an unfortunate amount of literature available in the social science realm that never seems to trickle down into the philosophy of religion discussions. Um, how we form beliefs backwards. We tend to intuit beliefs. We tend to grab onto what seems true at first, and then we backwards rationalize why we believe that. And that's how everybody works. It takes a lot of effort not to work that way. And working the opposite can actually feel not just discomfort, but painful. And um, and so I think for a lot of people, they've arrived at, well, there's a couple of things going on. They've arrived at a place of what they believe, and um, and when they're asked or expected to kind of pull that apart, the first thing that's going on is, well, they didn't arrive at this place through a process of reasoning, because they arrived at it the way we normally arrive at our belief systems or intuitions about the world, which is we feel them, we have an initial reaction or experience, and we make an assumption, and then we work backwards to explain to ourselves why we think this way. We do that with our morality. We do that with our beliefs about metaphysical things like God or the afterlife or ghosts or whatever else. We also do it with like political beliefs, um, and doing it the other way around. It takes a lot of mental effort. It takes a lot of, well, on a really basic level, it takes a lot of calories for your brain to do that, and our brains have evolved to conserve that energy whenever possible. So, and we could go into like cognitive biases, and that's basically what I'm talking about here is how we form beliefs with those biases. The second thing going on, and one of the things that I was that really changed how I have interactions with people when we have different beliefs, is that through a series of experiments involving functional magnetic resonance imaging scans of people's brains while they're having conversations or discussions, we know that our brains react to a perceived attack on our beliefs or a perceived threat to our beliefs exactly the same way as they react to a physical threat. We don't make a distinction between the two. We aren't able to differentiate. So when perhaps we can come and say, hey, like, haven't you thought about this? Haven't you seen how these things kind of add up like that? Like, can't you see this? It's the same at coming at somebody with a knife. It's perceived as a physical threat. And we react that way, and we all do this. This is another important thing to, I think, keep in mind, that um, we all react to those perceived threats in that way, unless we are stopping ourselves and saying, hang on, this is my initial reaction. I don't necessarily need to go with this. I can take a step back, and I can remove myself from the emotion, and we can actually look at this with reason. And I think all of us need to do that, whether we've remained in a religion or whether we haven't. We all have to uh, do the work to make our beliefs available for discussion without feeling that initial sense of assault. And that's really changed how I've gone about conversations with people when we do have different beliefs. If I'm talking to someone and they say, "Well, I believe in I believe in fairies, or I believe in ghosts, or I believe in God, or I believe that the pyramids were built by aliens," me saying, "Well, that's clearly nonsense," is going to put their back up. And one of the things that helped me kind of gain some skills to do that a little less. Not saying I always get it right, and especially if I'm reacting to someone on a social media platform, I certainly get it wrong more often than I'd like. But spending 10 years as a clinician, as a counselor, working with people who primarily have substance use issues, and maybe feeling very defensive or protective of those, you kind of learn how to have conversations about these concepts or about very special or sacred or personal concepts, which sometimes an addiction can really feel like, without making the person feel threatened, and that can be a lot more uh, beneficial for everybody involved than sometimes the going head to head. And one of the reasons why I don't do debates, or why I'm not very interested in debates, because I'm not. I know they have their place. I'm just not sure they're always the best tool to have in our toolbox. If the only tool you have is a nail, or sorry, a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? So
Exactly.
um, we'll actually be doing in a couple of weeks. I, among other things in my life, I volunteer for Humanist Canada, and in a couple of weeks we'll be doing a webinar called "Home for the Holidays: How to Have Challenging Conversations with Family and Friends."
Hmm.
And it's mostly about how to have dialogue with people when you do have disagreements, and how to avoid you know, uh, those kinds of arguments that are going to just be relationship breaking. You can't always. There's definitely going to be people who aren't willing to have any dialogue. But
Yeah.
and of course, there's also situations where if it's someone's identity that's being threatened, if it's a gay person who's going to a family gathering where they're not safe. I mean, absolutely. Like you can't tell people they have to go and be calm and rational in those situations. People need to do what keeps them safe. But
Hmm.
yeah, I think that there's a lot that obviously we could unpack there. There's been several books and university courses done on this kind of subject.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to add a couple quick thoughts. Number one, thank you for your work with Humanist Canada. It's awesome. I'd love to. Is that a video that I could link to once it's up? Is it, or is it just like a live thing?
So it's going to be live the first Wednesday in December, which
Okay.
I'm not sure when this is getting posted, but at first it's going to be for members of Humanist Canada, and then it's going to be posted publicly
Okay.
as a publicly available webinar.
Nice. Well, when it's available, I'll put the link beneath our video so people can go check it out. So it might not be there right away, but
Mhm.
come for those that watch this in a couple weeks, they can come check it out. But that's great. I mean, I've been reading even some stuff. We just had Thanksgiving here in the U.S. and some awful stuff. People sitting at their table and people around them literally praying. Please help the people that are so grossly deceived to
Mhm.
wake up or something like that. And it's like you're like, Dad, I'm right here. But
Mhm.
it's very sad stuff and a lot of toxic stuff. But I do want to ask, just going back a little bit to your story, can you confirm, would you say that when you were making your profession of faith in Christ, that you would have acknowledged that in that process, and maybe that was saying the prayer, or whatever, that you were saying, I'm a sinner who deserves to be punished, and Christ took my punishment, he lived a righteous life, and therefore he's my substitute as well as his righteousness is being attributed to me. That's what gets me saved, is he's my perfect substitute for the horrible things that I otherwise should be punished for myself.
Uh, I genuinely don't remember how specific it got. I mean, substitutionary atonement was certainly the theology that the church I was coming into operated under, but I don't recall the specifics of the prayer. That does sound like what we were acknowledging as
Yeah.
these are our beliefs, and certainly what I believed for a lot of years.
Gotcha. Or I
But as
mean,
far as the exact
even
prayer,
oversimplifying it, we're sinners and he's the rescuer. And he's, as long as we acknowledge that, we're saved, that kind of stuff.
yeah, I think that basically sums it up.
The corollary that I was going to ask with that is, when you got to that point, did you feel like there was any developing urgency to be more active with saving other people around you, and this compulsion to say, like, if I'm acknowledging that this is necessary for me, it's necessary for you and you too, and the outcome is very bad if you don't hear about it, if you don't accept it. Did you feel that compulsion to be more literally evangelical?
Yeah, I think it would be safe to say that I did, and that's partly why I went into Bible college and then seminary after graduating high school. It's partly why I went into ministry, and even as a teen, I knew I wanted to help people, and the seeds of humanism had been planted by people like my parents and people and places like Star Trek. And so those seeds were growing, and it seemed like the most natural place to do that was ministry. So I like went to Bible college, and I went and got into ministry and started seminary, and was actively doing ministry at Youth for Christ. Um, but there was still, I think, uh, that sort of kernel inside of my mind that was slowly growing and building, where I was saying, I do want to make sure that this is all really true. So I really want to keep investigating all this stuff. So I read Lee Strobel's other book, The Case for Creation, or A Case for a Creator, whichever that was, the one on evolution. And I was really distressed because it was not accurate. And I just thought, oh gosh, like there's got to be better stuff out there than this. And so as I was, going through seminary now at the time, because I'd graduated Bible college, I'd gotten married to a wonderful woman, who her and I have continued to grow and change. We're completely different people than we were, 21 years ago when we got married, when we were far too young. And um, and throughout Bible college, I hadn't quite managed to find the enough of that, I guess, apologetics evidence or whatever it was I was looking for, and um, and that was causing a lot of cognitive dissonance for me, um, which I think you probably talked about with a lot of people around your show. So cognitive dissonance is when you feel like your beliefs are at conflict with each other, or when you feel like the evidence you're getting is causing you to doubt, or to seem like your beliefs might not actually be accurate, and you feel distress and anxiety, and you're motivated to either discard one or the other beliefs, or to try to rationalize, to bring them together somehow, to um, you know it's trying to unify the elements in your cognitive system that are causing you these problems. And um, when we sort of lean on cognitive biases, or when we lean on these rationalizations, or when we protect our beliefs in the way that you described people earlier, being angry, those are all attempts to reduce cognitive dissonance. They're all attempts to try to reduce that unpleasant feeling. They're self-protective. We can always understand when someone wants to protect themselves. So that's, I think, a good reminder for all of us when we're kind of entering those conversations too. Um,
Can I ask, with that spot though, where you're saying you were dealing with cognitive dissonance, and you were just asking the questions of trying to read these books to prove that this was definitely real? The first thought that came to mind as you're saying that was, most Christians I've come across who would have said something like that would have at the same time had this parallel of, but I'm not really questioning it because I talk to God. I feel him. I know he's there. Like I'm
mhm,
not questioning, is this worldview right? I might have my theology that needs some tweaking, but like the question of, is it real? Is this worldview correct? Is he there?
mhm,
Like I talk to him every day. Of course he's there. Was that
mhm.
part of your feeling in this, or how would you phrase it?
Well, I didn't really have that because I didn't feel that presence. I didn't feel like it was a reciprocal, relationship. I literally felt like I was talking to the ceiling every time
Mm.
I prayed, despite praying daily and reading the Bible daily and doing devotions and doing, like, ticking all the boxes. And for years, I'd be asking, like, the youth pastor or my friends, like, how do I get closer to God? How do I do this right? And so read the Bible, pray, got all these lists of things, and I was doing them all and getting nothing in return, which is why I gravitated
Mm.
towards the more intellectual side of things. So for me, well, I know God's real because of these experiences, was never really part of it. I was trying to make up for that lack. And we know
Right.
now, all the different brain systems involved in causing or creating religious experiences. And we know that it happens across all religions and no religions. We know that um, we know the parts of the brain that are involved, and we have some really good theories as to why. And you know, maybe in a minute we can talk a bit more about that stuff. But for me, it was a genuine sense of like, I've really got to figure this out because I don't have that other assurance that people have, and I wasn't really willing to take it on their word because a lot of the people who were telling me, oh no, like God's, I know God's real because I've got all these feelings, but we're also telling me like, well, God gave me a message for you, and this is what it is, or well, I think God wants me to do this thing, which was clearly just what they already wanted to do,
Right.
or like lots of just I don't really know if I can trust everybody's judgment about this stuff, so I should really, I don't want to outsource my doxastic labor, as the saying goes. I need to figure this out for myself. And and like a lot of people, that meant adapting some of my beliefs to reduce the cognitive dissonance. There's a scholar of religion back in the 70s named Van Harvey, and he talked about cognitive dissonance and religion and said that people tend to react to the cognitive dissonance in religion in one of two ways. And the first is to double down and become more fundamentalist and to really fix it on the apologetics and to latch onto those rationalizations and really make them your identity or make them your shield around your faith. And the second was to accommodate your beliefs or to adapt your beliefs to become more humanistic, pragmatic, and socially liberal. So it allows you to stay in the in group. So really, fundamentalism and progressive Christianity are two sides of the same coin that are working to reduce cognitive dissonance in the believer's mind. Now, obviously, one side of that coin is significantly better for planet Earth and the people on it, because you see progressive Christians allying with Freedom from Religion Foundation, for instance. You see progressive Christians doing a lot of on the ground work with people in the inner city, people like my parents. You see a lot of progressive Christians voting in directions that are socially liberal, that are appropriate, that are going to be helping people on a broad scale. So definitely that was the direction we'd certainly prefer people to go. It was the direction I was going. I was a progressive Christian for a long time. At some point when I was in ministry, my seminary education was trending into counseling, and I was planning on completing a counseling psychology degree. And I had very good relationships with my professors and very good relationships with the Christian friends in my life, but was still just struggling with this persistent suspicion that I wasn't right about all this stuff. And I did have, I should say, people in my life who weren't upset with me for asking questions. There were people who were upset, but I was really fortunate to have just really good quality people around me, Christian or not. And I had one friend in particular who I remember when I was just about to leave high school, I was telling my youth group friends again, like, I really don't know if I believe this stuff. Like, I'm really struggling and I'm feeling really down. And a bunch of them said, well, you know what? I think you're just doing this to yourself at this point. Like, you're just looking for attention. If you really wanted to believe, you'd just be believing and you wouldn't be so annoying, basically. And then another friend
Lovely.
just said, well, yeah, it is what it is. They're like,
That's
what
crazy.
I have a hard time blaming teenagers for saying stupid things, having worked with them for 15 years.
Yeah.
But I had another friend who said, well, I'm always going to be here for you, Dan. And when your questions go past what I know, we can just look for the answers together. It's always going to be okay. And I'm still friends with that guy. And, we were in each other's wedding parties. We still get together. He's a believer and I'm not a believer, obviously, but, it just goes to show that there's an awful lot of just genuine altruism and genuine goodness in humanity across the spectrum of belief, whatever people believe or don't believe.
Yeah.
And I think after being in ministry for about 6.5 years and really struggling to find good reasons to keep believing, I wouldn't say I was deconstructing at that point yet, because I was trying desperately to find good evidence. And people would tell me, oh, well, this is the good evidence you've been looking for. And I'd look into it, and there's all these gaps, there's all these shortcomings, there's just actual falsehoods involved. I don't think this is what I've been looking for. And I was reading all the classics like William Lane Craig, and I tried reading like some of the bigger philosophers like Swinburne. I hope that's how you say his name. I was reading a lot of books by Dr. Alistair McGrath, who is a PhD chemist, I think, and a PhD theologian. So was just like consuming everything. But there's always this point where they would say, well, like at some point you just got to take this on faith. And I kept saying, I get that, but if there's obvious falsehoods in the things you're saying, or if there's obvious defeaters to your statements, then I don't really know if I can follow what you're saying. I guess it came down to a lot of people will use like Occam's razor and say like, well, Occam's razor, and just kind of gloss over. But what they're really talking about is abductive reasoning. They're talking about trying to make a good determination of what's true using the fewest amount of unfounded assumptions. And especially with things like creation. And so there's the Kalam cosmological argument, which I'm sure you and most of your listeners are aware of. It's basically saying like the universe had to come from somewhere, had to have a cause, and that cause is most probably God. And if it's most probably God, it's most probably the God of the Bible. So just believe in Jesus already. That's the, really, really short form of it. But I was starting to ask, and as I was transitioning out of ministry and into secular employment as a counselor, I was trying to ask how and when should we be saying now we need to take things on faith? And I realized this is about 2010 that I didn't think that supernatural things could be explanations anymore. At least not while there were still possible naturalistic explanations. So the question for me was, at what point do we abandon naturalistic explanations for observations or claims? And this is an example that came up in conversation with myself and a friend. So Tim, suppose you and I are walking the field and we come across a circle of flowers, and it's a perfect circle. And neither of us have been here before, and we didn't see them being planted or nothing like that. And you say, so where do these flowers come from? And I say, well, maybe a gardener came and did this. Maybe a resident in the area came and did this. Maybe these flowers naturally grow like this. But I don't know. Could be anything. And you say, well, I know these flowers were planted by fairies, and since you can't prove that that's false, I must be right. So that's essentially the Kalam on a small scale. But it really, that conversations like it made me ask, should we ever accept a supernatural explanation? Well, possible naturalistic explanations exist, especially when those naturalistic explanations have good evidence to support them, and the evidence for the theological explanations are either filled with self-defeaters. They fall apart because of their own flaws, or there's defeaters that you can find for them out in the world, or the arguments are just by essence really weak, because when we go back to like a God of the gaps thing, like God did it as our primary explanation for something like why we have human morality or why we have a universe, you can replace the proper noun with just about anything. God did it, fairies did it, Allah did it, super powerful aliens did it, and you can replace the proper noun, and there's no loss of coherence in the argument. I don't actually think that's an argument for what you're saying it is. I think that's that's not using good reason to get to explanations. And so in around 2010, I was asking a lot more of those questions. I transitioned out of ministry and I started deconstructing, which is what we're calling it now.
Did you leave ministry specifically because you were concerned, or that was just incidental?
That was a big part of it. It was finding it really difficult to believe anymore. It was I couldn't lead people to Christ. I didn't, if it was something I wasn't convinced about. Um, I'd also been becoming more progressive, and as a result, I was looking back at harms I'd done to people who had talked to me who were gay, or people who had talked to me who had different beliefs, and thinking about how I treated them and just feeling really ashamed and thinking I'm doing more harm than good. I think if I stay in this place, I think I need to go. Um,
Mm.
and left ministry, started secular employment, started attending a different church after a couple of years, and it was a bit more a progressive church, and there were some good friends we made there. But even as I was going and becoming involved in church, and I was now starting to, thanks to my newer education in counseling, I was becoming really interested in mental health and faith, and how people still struggled with mental health issues when they were Christians. And I noticed there was some judgment that people were given around that, and I didn't think that was right. I had a really amazing professor in seminary, um, and he was my advisor and in my program, and he was my friend afterwards. He was my mentor, um, and he used to do these talks because before he became a counselor and a professor, he was a pharmacist. He used to do these talks for churches and for Christian groups and for communities about how it's okay to take antidepressants if you're a Christian. And that was the basics of it. But he also went into a lot of like history of antipsychotics and the history of psychotropic medications and where these things came from. And they arrived out of nowhere, almost like a miracle. And people woke up and went back to their families, and they left, these institutions just emptied. And he was so passionate about it, and I got passionate about it. And so with his blessing, I continued doing some of that work, and I spoke at churches, and I spoke at Christian conferences, and I was very passionate about it. And I was very frustrated when, I'd talk about, hey, kids, it's okay to take an antidepressant if you have depression. It's, you're still going to be a Christian. You're not a bad Christian. You do this. And then, they'd go outside, and I'd see the youth pastors like getting their kids together in a huddle and being like, okay, but actually you just really need Jesus. And, or even sometimes challenging me in my sessions. And
I remember there was a lot of subculture, Christian subcultures pushing so hard against that stuff.
yeah. And at the same time, those churches kept asking me back, and those conferences kept asking me back and saying, you know what, we actually do think this is really important. We got a lot of people struggling. We want to get them help. And so, like, credit where credit's due, I was really happy to do that for the time that I was doing it. And with my mentor's, blessing, I did so. And when he passed away from cancer during the pandemic, and having lost someone that I was so close to and that I had such love and respect for, who was a lifelong Christian, to the end of his days. And I spoke to him the day before he died. And it's always been, I felt, as much as I know I made some mistakes, as much as I know I probably hurt some people, I'm still very proud of the work that he and I did together, and the work that I carried on with him. And no longer being a believer, I don't go to those conferences anymore, but I've provided those resources and those slideshows and those presentations to Christian counselors I know who are able to continue that work, because I still do think it's a very important message.
Yeah. Could we hone in just a little bit on what was the actual time frame where you clearly were saying, even privately to yourself, I definitely don't believe this stuff anymore, or at least as close as you can get to that without being vocal? And like, what point, what were you at that point while you were at these churches, or when did that hit?
So that's an interesting question, because I'm actually not quite sure.
Okay.
I don't know if you've read any Jane Austen,
Yeah,
or
quite a
so
bit.
Pride and Prejudice is like one of the most perfect books ever written, I think. And not just because Mr. Darcy is like an actually like mentally healthy male portrayed in fiction who can, acknowledge when he's made mistakes, which is super rare, but because there's this part that I just resonated with so well. In one of his statements to Elizabeth when he's professing his love. He's trying to say like when he fell in love with her, and he says, I cannot fix on the hour or the spot or the look or the words which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew I had begun. And that's how it was for me. I started deconstructing in 2010. I publicly acknowledged that I no longer believed in 2020. There's a point somewhere in the middle where it was not just struggling to believe, but active disbelief. But I don't know when it was. I know that when I went back to grad school in 2017 to no longer pursue a Christian degree, but to pursue a master's in psychology from a secular university, I know that at that point I was saying things like, well, even if there is no God, the church is still a force for good in the world, and I want to be a part of that. And I can still do my presentations and still help churches get this stuff together. But I was still like praying with my family, and but it was very much like I'm doing this because I love my family, and because maybe these feelings I have about there being no God are wrong. Maybe there's something out there, and yeah, I couldn't point at a date. I still called myself a Christian, but I was so progressive in my Christianity that I didn't even really think that God was real. He was just a useful fiction, I think, is the statement that some people say. And so there's this sort of amorphous decade where I crossed that line without noticing. And then looking back, I can see, statements and things I'd said and things I'd done, which were evidence that I had crossed the line, but I don't know exactly when it was.
Yeah.
And even though I don't know exactly when it was, I do know that the results of that weren't always good at first. I felt a bit more anxiety about like, well, what does this mean now? Like I had a grandparent who passed away at that time, and thought, well, now what do I believe? What happened to them? And I just tried not to think about those things as much as possible until the pandemic hit, and then my belief that the church was overall a force for good in the world, the last dregs of that kind of drained away, or at least there are a lot of churches that are a force for good. There are a lot of people, because there's a lot of people in them who are trying to do good. The institution has all the problems that institution does, but people are basically altruistic, and you can find those people anywhere. So I just knew that I couldn't participate anymore. I couldn't claim the useful fiction anymore. It was not something that I could do. And then I got angry with myself. I got angry with Christians who were pushing the anti-mask, anti-vax stuff, or Christians who were fighting or speaking out against Black Lives Matters, or like, I just got angry, and I was super unpleasant to be around for a while. And one of the things that I think got me a little stuck there was the fact that people who have ADHD, because we're always looking for sources of dopamine to fulfill this deficit, and we're always trying to be really protective of the dopamine that we do have. When we acknowledge something as a threat to our dopamine, we get very protective or very reactive about it. So for me, I was very angry about the church. I was very angry about religion, because I was trying to protect myself. I was getting stuck in rumination, and stuck in holding on to the grief that I felt at as much as I never felt the presence of God, as much as despite doing all the right things, and confessing all the sins and everything, despite doing everything I was supposed to do and not having that, losing that construct was still a loss. And it did feel like a death. It did feel like losing someone that I'd loved. And it's funny because some people talk about like, oh, like they're just so relieved that there is no God, or that, they feel like a weight coming off. For me, it wasn't at first like a weight. It was more like attending a funeral, because
Yes.
I could never quite grasp the idea of God as this judgmental asshole that so many people seem to think. And I always was like, no, he's got like, if my parents are this loving and supportive, there's no way that they're more loving and supportive than God is. So that's got to be like, God's got to be better than that, at least, at the
Yeah.
very least. And so it was that loss. It was a sadness that came out of it, and because of that sadness, I got angry. And um, it wasn't until realizing like, oh no, I've actually gotten myself stuck here, and this is my ADHD trying to protect me, and I actually need to be intentional about moving past this and not just wait for it to pass. And then that involved doing some work. That involved, talking to a therapist. That it also involved, um, finding sources of information and comfort that weren't just, Christopher Hitchens debates, some random, some poor priest who's just getting his ass handed to him by Christopher Hitchens, which must feel awful, and finding places like the Graceful Atheist podcast, and
Hitchens was so
um,
good at that.
yeah, and uh, and finding places like Humanist Canada, which, and even humanism as a concept and as a landing place. A secular humanist is how I describe myself. When people talk to me and they say, "So what do you actually believe? Like, do you believe that there's no God? Do you believe like?" I usually say things like, I whatever theories that we have about um, deities throughout history, I don't think any of them have ever had sufficient evidence to support their belief, nor have they had sufficient explanatory power uh, to explain what's around us. That's greater than naturalistic explanations. There's lots of disconfirmations for the claims of the Bible and for other things. I don't think there's any reason to believe that they're anything but human inventions. So when it comes to the Christian, the classical theist character called God, I think most people would consider me to be an atheist. When
Hmm.
it comes to like a deist God, something that created the universe and walked away, or a spiritual energy or a cosmic mind that's behind the scenes, or whatever, I guess I'd be an agnostic. I have no real way to confirm or disconfirm those things. But when people ask me what I am, I say I'm a secular humanist, and that means that believing that in the potential of human beings to be kind and to solve problems and to continually make the world a better place. That our ability to be cruel is outweighed by our ability to be altruistic and humane
Yes.
and fair. Um, and I believe the best things that have come out of religion in the world have come because people made them happen. Um, and so, and I think that's why I still maintain so many relationships with people who do have religious belief, because I think that we're all just people, and I get to choose how big my in group is. I get to choose how big my family is, and I choose as many people as I can who are willing to still do good in the world, whatever they happen to believe. And there's obviously points of disagreement and points of contention that come up, but I do believe the similarities are able to outweigh the differences. And I've also been fortunate to see, some very good, very close friends move more in that progressive way. And I think about Bart Ehrman, the biblical studies professor, who he's an atheist and he teaches at a Christian university. And he says he's not trying to deconvert anybody; he's just trying to make them less fundamentalist. And I think that's a win either way, honestly. So
Yeah, for sure.
my focus has really shifted from I feel angry and I argue about this stuff as little as I did it, so it was still there and still a part of my life and still maybe not super pleasant to be around. My focus has really shifted to, well, what do we have in common? Common values are more important than common beliefs. What are we willing to work towards together? How do we how do we make our corner of the world a better place? Um, if humanity is on a trajectory, and that eventual future could be, in the dirt here on Earth or in the stars somewhere, what do we need to throw our weight against to make sure we survive that long? To make sure that our species can, can someday do those things that I watched on Star Trek. That we can someday be, just going on and seeing what this wonderful universe is like. Like, we're not going to be here for that, but maybe, maybe the people who are will look back on us and think kindly of us, and that might be the only eternal life we ever get. But it's something that I feel compelled to work for.
Hmm. Well said. Well said. I know we're almost out of time, so just a few quick hits here of questions. First question, I was curious, did you, as you're going through the deconversion process and it's kind of hitting you that you're truly escaping, that you're looking back and realizing, yeah, that I'm in the middle of this process. It looks like this is going to end up with me fully deconverting. There's implications there that are really hard to deal with. You touched on some of them, but the biggest one for many of us is the afterlife. How did you process losing that and just the idea that, whether you thought there definitely wasn't one, or at least you're agnostic of, who knows at this point, but wherever you landed, the idea of I'm certain that it's heaven and it looks like a biblical heaven, when that disappeared, how
Mm.
did you respond to it?
Yeah, so that also felt like a bit of a loss to me as well. Almost, if not more significant than losing the character of God. Um, because I still I thought my whole believing life that this was going to be like the end goal for all of us. And even though in the last few years I was more of a universalist than anything, I still kind of maintained a generally biblical heaven kind of idea. Um, there were a few things that kind of came out of that. One was just, grieving again all the people I'd lost. That included family, that included friends, friend people who had died too young, and thinking, oh, they're actually gone. They're actually gone now, and I don't have that comfort anymore. So that was a process. And still, like, you know, nobody knows what happens after we die, and maybe the panpsychists are right, and consciousness is just a feature of the universe, and our consciousnesses are just going to go on somehow, or transform, or become rocks, or I don't know. Like, I actually don't really understand panpsychism, if you couldn't tell. But it's like, maybe people are right about something like that. I have no way of knowing, and I've seen no evidence. I think the evidence that we have from traumatic brain injury, uh, research indicates that I think a soul is probably not a real thing, or if it is, it's so married to our physical brains that damage to our physical brains can dramatically change our characters and our values, and that's a whole other bag of cats.
Yeah.
Um, I I think that as I've as I was approaching the acknowledgement that I was no longer a Christian, I was more scared of the idea of losing heaven than I actually wound up being scared after I'd lost it. Um, Partly because I kind of realized, well, I actually don't think I'm going to be here to mind. Like, we have this idea that if there's no heaven, then we're going to die, and we're just going to be like alone forever, or like a mind in a void, or like, I actually just think I'm probably just going to stop. And if I don't, okay. Um, there were a few things that made me feel a little better about it, and uh, and one of them was the idea that, um, like, whatever happens, it's happening to all of us. Like, I'm not alone. Whatever's happening to me is going to happen to it's happened to everybody who's came before me. It's going to happen to everybody who came after me. Um, and whatever happens, we're all together in it. Whether it's nothing, whether it's something. Um, whatever happens to both of us. And uh, in a small way, that seemed comforting to me. Um, the other thing that I found comforting was actually when I was watching a TV show called Scrubs, which you may or may not have seen,
A little bit.
about, like doctors in a hospital, like young doctors, and there's this uh, one scene where these two doctors are talking to a patient who's terminal, and the concept of like what happens after you die comes up, and they kind of go back and forth. It's a comedy show mostly, so they there's some funny stuff, and then the doctors just said, I just hope my last thought was a good one, and I would like to live in such a way that that is as assured as possible, that my last thought is a good one, that I know I'm loved, that the people that I love know that they're loved, and um, yeah, and like Keanu Reeves said in his interview with Stephen Colbert. I don't know if you've seen this
Yeah.
interview, but um,
It's a
I
good
think
one.
that was the final kind of piece for me, was his interview, in kind of coming to grips or to terms with no longer thinking the afterlife was going to be a thing for me. Um, where Stephen Colbert asks Keanu, he says, "What do you think happens when we die?" And he just kind of takes a deep breath and says, "I think that the ones who love us will miss us, and I also want to live in such a way that I am missed, and that means not being a total asshole, whether I'm a believer or not. That means uh, choosing kindness and compassion and understanding whenever I can, and I'm not always good at it. In fact, sometimes I'm quite bad at it. There's certain people or certain subjects that rile me up beyond beyond repair." Um, but I'm trying to get a little better at that, and trying to be a little more kind and understanding. And sometimes I'm able to actually do it. So maybe there's hope for the human race after all.
Yeah, exactly. Good answer. One last question, I'll let you go. It's two-parter though. You can hit them quickly, but other people. Number one, how did other people in general respond to your deconversion as you became more vocal about it? And then the second part, more specifically, how did your wife deal with your talking through these topics?
I'll answer those in reverse order if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So my wife and I deconstructed, um, more or less at the same time, though along slightly different trajectories. Um, I've been very fortunate that both of us maintained a lot of the same values, and those values were kind of growing in us when we were younger. Like when we got married, it was a bit of a culture shock for both of us. I grew up in an egalitarian home, and she grew up in a more complementarian home. So we got married, and I remember sitting in our first apartment. She's like, "Okay, so you're the head of the household now," and I was like, "I'm the what? What? What is this about?" And so we bounced around uh, for on that subject for a while. Um, she's a really smart and uh, really insightful person. So there are multiple points, during my deconstruction where I was like, I don't think that I believe in a literal hell, and she's like, I can't remember the last time I believed in a literal hell. Like, and so she was often ahead of me in the movement towards progressive Christianity, or
Mm,
you know the movement towards a healthier way of being with your religious belief in the world.
that's so awesome.
Um, when I arrived at saying, okay, like I'm agnostic at the very least, I can't, like, when I finally started publicly or openly saying that, there was definitely some bumps as we tried to navigate those, and most of those bumps were because I was just really angry about having the process I'd gone through, and really angry because I was grieving, um, and for her, the a lot of the baked in evangelical nonsense never really got baked in fully. So she was always a much more open person than I was, always a much more understanding person. Um, and so for her, the concept of God as being a, judgmental kind of like, I don't know if that ever was a part of her mental anatomy. Um, and so now she would probably describe herself as spiritual but not religious. Um, and she's a spiritual director. She's gone through a program to become a registered spiritual director. She's also like got you know a freelancing business and that is not related to spiritual direction. But she especially talks to people, I think, who are involved in their own deconstruction. So really, there's two kind of landing places in our home. For me, it was this path of the skeptic, and skepticism drove my questioning. Skepticism drove where I landed, and it's driving me today even to be skeptical about what I've currently decided I believe. Like maybe that's wrong too. I need to be open to that. For her, it was more of like the path of the mystic. What does it mean to be a human being in the world? How do we have relationships with ourselves and with the world around us? Like, um, is this something that we would call spiritual as humanists or as spiritual but not religious people? I think there's a good um, amount of discussion about language and what might be appropriate versus inappropriate language around religion or spirituality. And Humanist Canada runs a chaplain program, and I'm not a chaplain in it, but I know there's a lot of people who are, and they released a statement recently that I'm just going to read if it's okay.
Yeah,
They
please.
say, we understand many fellow atheists and humanists prefer not to use the word spiritual. However, if we aspire to be invited to take a seat at the table with other faith-based chaplains across Canada, we need to affirm some common language about our shared purpose. In our program, we define it as follows. All humans are spiritual beings insofar as they yearn for meaning, purpose, and connectedness in the world, and must contend with moral and ethical challenges and existential hardships related to death and loss. And so I feel like that's, I certainly don't use the word spiritual for myself, but I can see where that's coming from, and I respect it, and I respect people who use it. So for my wife and I, even though we've arrived at slightly different places along slightly different paths, uh, we share a lot of same values. We started new traditions, and when we're done here, I'm going to go upstairs for one of them, which is to have a family brunch on Sundays where we will do a reading, and the reading might be from poetry, or it might be from a favorite book, or it might be from a spiritual writer of history, whether it's Christian or Buddhist or something, anything to give insights into human nature. So even though I would say definitely there were some bumps, and those bumps were mostly due to my attitude while I was processing my deconversion, I think that we've arrived at uh, some pretty good places together, and there's always room for growth and change, and that's fine. I don't expect we'll be the same people in 10 years as we are now, because we certainly aren't the same people we were when we got married 21 years ago.
Yeah, that's awesome. I
As
love that
far as
your story is including so much, just respect and love for each other. That's so critical.
yeah, as far as the other relationships, certainly there were friends who said they were disappointed in me, friends who said that, sometimes taking the easy way out isn't the right way, and which I don't think showed a lot of understanding of what it actually took to get to where I got to. Um, some people who said like, well, maybe if you just really spend more time reading the Bible, you're gonna like God will speak to you. And I thought, I mean, years of Bible college, seminary, and ministry, and decades in the church, I genuinely don't know. Like, what else do you want me to do? I've done all the right things. Um, some people have said like, well, are you just wanting to like to live in your pride or live in your sin, like the benefits of your sin? And I just where do I sign up? Like I don't I don't think I've gotten many benefits. Um certainly hasn't helped my income. I since deconverting, I was offered adjunct faculty positions at both a Bible college and at a seminary, and had to tell them, look, I don't believe in God anymore. If that's still one of your requirements, I don't think we're going to be able to do it.
Yeah,
And
that
then I
might
got,
be a requirement.
yeah, might be an entry level
Wow.
requirement. And I got the well, thanks but no thanks response. And frankly, teaching at Bible college and seminary as uh, a side job had always been my plan, and was my plan for after I retired from my job in 15, 20 years. I always wanted to teach at a Bible college. So that's a sacrifice or a change that's had to happen for my life. Um, but the majority of people, even ones who disagree with me, have like we maintain relationship, we maintain friendships. Most of the good people that I know are Christians, because most of the people I know are Christians, just like most of the bad people I know are Christians. I think we all kind of, morally speaking, exist along a bell curve. And so you find, good believers and good atheists. You find medium believers and medium atheists. You find bad believers and bad atheists. I think the belief systems have little to do with our moral actions, except when we have our moral actions twisted by an ideology that asks us to do bad things. And that certainly has been religion in the past for a lot of people, and it can be other things, as we've seen with like the Mao's Great Leap Forward, or the terrible actions of communism and all kinds of stuff. Like any ideology can become harmful if people are willing to follow its dictates instead of follow their own altruistic impulses. We have uh, much more good in us, I think, than both in Christians believe and then atheists believe. I think we're generally a good species, and if we keep working together, we'll be able to create a good future.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I love to remind my kids as I'm doing things to protect their minds, like, can you be good without a God? And like, yes, we can be good without a God. And it's amazing when you think through it that all this stuff that we were thinking we were attributing to a God, it's part of our culture, it's part of our consciousness, it's part of our willingness to be better and better as a species. And it's awesome to not attribute it to Yahweh anymore or to Jesus, but to ourselves, and to recognize that we still have a long way to go. But I love it. I'm so glad to hear that your family is was able to be intact through this, and you all grew closer through it. And it's awesome. Awesome. I love what you're doing with your family today and your kids. Um, I have a lot more questions, so maybe we can do a follow-up at some point. But thank you so much. This has been awesome. You've given me a lot to chew on, honestly. You've some stories I feel like I'm just like kind of tracking, and it's it's like a story. Other times I feel like I'm more like just taking a bunch of mental notes, like I want to go think about that or research that. And you've definitely given me a lot to chew on, so I appreciate that very much. Did you have any final words before we wrap up?
Any final words? I guess just my uh, my perspective, having gone through, you know, evangelicalism into secular humanism, and seeing the broad range of belief systems on both sides. My caution for myself, and I'll tell you what I'm saying to myself. This is less like saying to other people, but if they find it useful, then great. Is to not fall into the same traps that I was in when I was a Christian, or was an evangelical Christian, which is to say, you know, ascribing goodness or badness to what people are believing. So I didn't become a better person because I became a secular humanist. I didn't become a better person by not believing in God. At best, I discarded some harmful beliefs that were harmful to me and others, but I'd been doing that already. And a lot of progressive Christians have discarded those beliefs. I think that the traps that we fall into once we deconvert can either be, assuming that if somebody deconverts, they'll become a better person or a smarter person, which I don't think is the case, and I don't think really got good evidence to believe that. At best, you will discard some harmful beliefs, but you might pick up others that are equally harmful. And we can see a lot of really famous atheists who are picking up harmful beliefs. A lot are following people like Jordan Peterson, or Richard Dawkins seems to have inexplicably gone against the biological evidence to become a spokesperson for or against like transgender rights, which is a bizarre kind of thing. Becoming an atheist doesn't just make you a good person, just like being a Christian didn't make you a good person. We're all just people trying to find our way. So that's the first kind of thing that I try to remind myself of. Um, the second thing that I try to remind myself of is uh, none of us have cornered the market on truth. None of us have cornered the market on what it means to be right or good. We're going to continue evolving. We're going to continue learning and growing. Um, I don't need people to believe what I believe in order to have a good relationship with them. I just need to be willing to do the work to have a good relationship with them. And that's a piece for me that um, has been important to learn and has been at times hard to learn, but it's been something that I've needed to learn, and I'm happy to have learned it as much as I have, and I hope to continue finding new ways to apply it.
Hmm. I love it. I love kind of how you're doing something that's been on my heart a lot too, is just to when you're when you're out to look back and kind of do a post-mortem and say, what does this tell us about ourselves? And it's like acknowledging, like you just said, that you can still think bad things or be a bad person even as a deconverted person. I mean, even just acknowledging the dynamic, you've spent your life, like your habit has for all these decades has been to be highly susceptible to really toxic ideas and to let them slide. And like that's just what you've been in. And we all have not, we see the red flags and we've just ignored them. That's what we're used to. So we make this change, but we have to still admit where we've come from and the acknowledgement that we were wrong before, and like you said, we could be wrong still, and hopefully we will keep a humility to say, and like David Ames says, that a grace to be willing to be humble and say there's more to learn, and I'm probably going to change, and I need to make sure that through it all I'm nice to the other people who have different opinions, because I might end up in their camp someday. And it's quite interesting how that works. But
Oh, totally. And I've seen I've seen a lot of different reactions from people about when someone deconverts, when a famous person deconstructs, and I just try to remind myself that those people who are reacting like that, they're reacting because their beliefs are being threatened, which, as we previously said, uh, gives you a feeling of being physically threatened. And so when I see those reactions, I try to start with understanding. I try to start with um, the expectation that this is a normal response, and that you know there's a lot of potential for conversation if we can talk about talking. We can talk about the conversation we're having, and not just try to have it. If we can say, you do seem like this is really important to you, and I can tell that, even someone who's like giving the hellfire damnation messages as damaging as that certainly can be, it certainly is for a lot of people. And religious trauma is a real issue. I don't ever want to diminish that. Um, they think they're doing the right thing. They think they're doing something morally good, and the foundations for those decisions are, yeah, they're complicated, and obviously whatever your intentions are, if you're doing harm, you're doing harm. But I think that it can sometimes be a very useful conversational tool to say, I see that you really care about people, and that's why you're giving these messages, because you genuinely believe that you're trying to save them from hell. That could be a great starting place for someone to feel understood, and then a conversation to actually be a little more productive, as opposed to saying, "Well, I think you're a moron," which yeah, tends to shut things down. Not that I've never said it or that I've ever never been it, because I certainly have been a moron in the past.
Yeah, and I've done the same thing. I've definitely. I mean, it's hard because you're towing this line of like they're in your mind in some ways they're in a cult, and some of them you're interacting with are cult leaders, and in arguably they're doing psychological damage to children especially, and it's like you want to toe that line. But yeah, the more grace we can have in it, and the more patience and humility, definitely will, I think, will pay off in the long run. But I know you got to run, so I'll let you go. But thank you so much. This has been awesome. I love your story. I love it. I love your insights, and I definitely want to keep picking your brain at some point. But I'll just wrap up by saying, everyone, we've been speaking with Daniel Dacombe. Daniel, thank you so much. Great to get to know you, and I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks so much.